The antinomy of the moral view of the world, that is, that there is a moral consciousness and that there is none, or that the validation of duty lies beyond consciousness and conversely takes place in it, these contradictions were gathered up in the idea in which the non-moral consciousness has moral validity. Its contingent knowing and willing are assumed to have full weight, and happiness is granted to it as an act of grace. Moral self-consciousness did not accept responsibility for this self-contradictory idea, but shifted it on to a being other than itself. But this placing outside of itself what it must think of as necessary is as much a contradiction as regards form as the other was as regards content. Because, however, what appear as contradictory propositions, which the moral consciousness makes clumsy efforts first to separate and then to reconcile, are intrinsically the same, since pure duty, that is, as pure knowing, is nothing else than the self of consciousness, and the self of consciousness is being and actuality. And similarly, because what is supposed to lie beyond actual consciousness is nothing else than pure thought, and thus is in fact the self, because this is so, self-consciousness for us, or in itself, retreats into itself and is aware that that being is its own self, in which what is actual is at the same time pure knowing and pure duty. It is itself in its contingency completely valid in its own sight and knows its immediate individuality to be pure knowing and doing, to be the true reality and harmony. With paragraph 632, we are now entering into another subsection of the Phenomenology of Spirit, and we have been laboring for quite some time through the longest big part of the book, Spirit, and Spirit is itself divided into subparts, and we have been lingering in this morality part for quite some time as well. You'll remember that Spirit had these 3 different sections, and each one of them has quite a lot going on in it. Now we're at the end, or at the beginning of a section, but at the end of Spirit. Does that mean that we've completely exhausted the shapes of consciousness? Well, not exactly, because Hegel is going to go into yet another quite long section, although nowhere near as long as Spirit, which is religion. And he has been tracing out the development of, you could say, world spirit, but also spirit in all of its subsidiary shapes that are advancing the dialectic here and there. And we've seen quite a lot going on in this previous parts of the morality section with this moral view of the world, the moralische Weltanschauung, right? And moral consciousness. We just passed through a section called dissemblance or duplicity, Verstellen, where all these different problems, or if you like, contradictions and antinomies of the moral consciousness appeared. And now we're bringing them to a kind of close and knot. And as I just said, beginning again at the start of a new subsection. And as usual, things start off in quite a good way. It looks like there's a lot of movement going forward. We should make some progress. And so let's start with what the text actually says here. He tells us the antinomy of the moral view of the world, that there is moral consciousness and that there is none, or, if we want to look at it another way, the validation of duty lies beyond consciousness, lies in something else, and conversely takes place in consciousness. These antinomies, really plural, although here he's talking about it in the singular, of the moral view of the world, these are going to be transformed. And we've just been, unpacking these at great length in the last 2 sections. So he tells us that these contradictions were gathered up in the idea in which the non-moral consciousness has moral validity. Now, the word idea there is actually translating Vorstellung, so in the representation, not in the concept or thought per se, but in a kind of representation, a kind of picture thinking of how things are. And this is a good place, since we're beginning a new section, just to remind ourselves of a few key ideas of Hegel. So Hegel is a great distruster of what we might call okay enough, but ultimately deficient forms of thought. And at the bottom, he places mere feeling, Gefühl, right? Totally subjective, liable to change from moment to moment. And then above that, we get to the realm of Vorstellungen, right? The representations. And these aren't bad. There's nothing absolutely wrong with them. But we often get caught up with them and treat them as if these frozen depictions of things are precisely the way things are. And this is how we get ourselves into trouble and caught in impasses in thought that then the dialectic has to move us past. Above this is going to be what is translated in Miller as the notion, but more often called the concept, the Begriff, right? And the kind of thought that involves grasping, begreifen, things in their totality, in their relations, and in the dynamic relations between them that are in the process of change, but have a certain sort of what Hegel likes to call necessity, but we might just call a certain rhyme and reason to. And this is going to happen in this section, of course, as usual, but here we're talking about a representation, and the representation or idea is what? That he says that the non-moral consciousness has moral validity. It's contingent. Knowing and willing are assumed to have full weight, and happiness is granted to it as an act of grace. We saw all of these themes being discussed in the previous section. So the non-moral consciousness somehow would be moral, and the moral consciousness would be what? A hypocrite, or duplicitous, or lying to itself. Really, we have three different terms here once we move past these antinomies. We have the non-moral consciousness, we have the moral consciousness, and then we have some being other than itself, the itself being the moral consciousness. So Hegel goes on and he says, moral consciousness did not accept responsibility. Didn't accept responsibility in what way? Does that make it non-moral? Or does that make it immoral? Non-moral might just be sort of a neutral, right? Immoral would be the defective moral consciousness. And the moral consciousness does not accept responsibility for all of the stuff that's going on here, this self-contradictory idea. But as Hegel says, it shifted it onto a being other than itself. And we saw this already in terms of the holy will, the supreme lawgiver, something that was a beyond, and that's already here. The validation of duty takes place beyond consciousness. Where? Beyond consciousness in Never Neverland? No, beyond in a being, in some sort of presumed, postulated holy will. Now the question we can ask ourselves is, are these really three, or should we think that these are two, or are they actually aspects of the one and same consciousness, sort of bifurcated, actually trifurcated, against itself? So Hegel goes on, he doesn't answer that question, but he does tell us that what's happening here in terms of the antinomies of the moral view of the world, right? They are a contradiction as far as content goes. He says that moral self-consciousness, placing outside of itself what it must think of as necessary, is a contradiction as regards form just as much as the other was as regards content. So he's playing here with the form and content distinction. There's something in the action or the comportment of moral consciousness in making sense out of itself, making sense out of what it means to be moral, which is carried out in its own reflexive activity, trying to be moral, right? So he goes on and he says, because what appear as contradictory propositions, which the moral consciousness makes clumsy efforts, first to separate and then to reconcile, are intrinsically the same, since pure duty, now here's kind of a stretch, right? Pure duty as pure knowing is nothing else than the self of consciousness, and the self of consciousness is being, sein, and actuality, Wirklichkeit. Now, we should pause there for a moment. What is Hegel saying here? Pure duty as pure knowing. He's saying pure duty is, in fact, pure knowing. And we saw something similar to this come up, did we not, in the previous section when we got to the portion where we led into absolute freedom, right? And Hegel's going to signal that in the next paragraph. So just keep that in the back of your mind, right? And he says, pure duty is nothing else than the self of consciousness. Now, that's worth dwelling on. How is duty the self of consciousness? Isn't duty something that we experience as imposed outside of ourselves, upon ourselves? Somebody says, you shall, or you shall not. You have a requirement, you have an obligation, you have a duty. Well, we've arrived at the point, through the development of consciousness, where it's not a purely extrinsic authority opposing from above, but rather quite the opposite. It's not even just some sort of inchoate, intuitive feeling from within, oh, I should do this or I should do that, right? It's not simply following out one's destiny or one's character, or whatever we want to say in those terms. Instead, it's what we as rational beings have realized ought to be the case for ourselves, and would be the case if we weren't so screwed up most of the time. Right? We have the imperfect moral consciousness that we talked so much about in the previous section. But we can't get away from duty. We can't get away from morality. It's haunting us, you might say. So he says the self of consciousness is being in actuality, and similarly, because what is supposed to lie beyond actual consciousness is nothing else than pure thought, and thus is, in fact, the self. Why is pure thought the self? Who's doing the thinking, right? When you say that the being beyond myself, the holy will, the supreme lawgiver, whatever it is that you're attributing, could be other things too, the force of history, the verdict of history, any of those sorts of things where we postulate some sort of transcendence and we say that's the thing that matters and I am just a miserable worm. Haven't we seen that before? A couple times already, right, in the dialectic? When you're doing that, that's really your thought, Hegel thinks, that you're not recognizing is your own thought. So now we're called upon to recognize that we're the ones actually driving the wagon here, running the show. That's my own terms, not Hegel's terms. So he goes on and he says, here we go. Thus, consciousness is in fact the self. Because this is so, self-consciousness for us, or in itself, retreats into itself. And it's aware that being is its own self, in which what is actual is at the same time pure knowing and pure duty. What is wirklich, right, is pure knowing and pure duty. Now notice what else he says here. It is, in its contingency, completely valid in its own sight. In the past, in its contingency was something bad, right? We don't want to be contingent in relation to the eternal. There's the unhappy consciousness. We don't want to be contingent in relation to the necessity of one or another spiritual power, whether it be the divine law, the human law, state power, wealth, the noble consciousness, on and on and on. We don't want to be a pure contingency in relation to the Enlightenment, do we? Or absolute freedom? No, we want to be the universal. We want to be the necessary, not the contingent. Yet here, the contingency is what is going to embody morality. So he says, it is itself in its contingency completely valid in its own sight and knows its immediate individuality to be pure knowing and doing, to be the true reality, again, Wirklichkeit, and Hegel uses the term harmony here, Harmonie in German, it's just a cognate, right? It knows itself to be that. So there is a return to the individual, and that's us at this point in the dialectic. This self of conscience, spirit that is directly aware of itself as absolute truth and being, is the third self. We have reached it as the outcome of the third world of spirit, and we shall briefly compare it with the two preceding selves. The totality or actuality, which shows itself to be the truth of the ethical world, is the self of the legal person. Its existence consists in its being acknowledged by others. Just as this person is the self that is devoid of substance, so it is its existence an abstract reality too. The person counts, and that simply as a person. The self is the point immediately at rest in the element of its being. That point is not separated off from its universality, and therefore the two are not actively related to one another. The universal is in it without any distinction, and neither the content of the self, nor is the self filled by itself. The second self is the world of culture, which has attained its truth, or it is spirit that has recovered itself from its dividedness, absolute freedom. In this self, that first immediate unity of individuality and universality is sundered. The universal, which all the same remains a purely spiritual entity, the state of being acknowledged or a universal willing and knowing, is object and content of the self and its universal reality. But it does not have the form of an existence free from the self. In this self, therefore, it obtains no filling and no positive content, no world. Moral self-consciousness does indeed let its universality go free so that it becomes a nature of its own, and equally it holds fast to it within itself as a superseded moment. It is, however, merely an insincere play of alternating these two determinations. It is as conscience that it first has in its self-certainty a content for the previously emptied duty, as also for the right and the universal will that were empty of content. And because this self-assurance is at the same time an immediacy, conscience exists. Here in paragraph 633, Hegel is connecting what is going to be happening in this section as the culmination of the morality portion of spirit with what went on in the other two parts of the spirit portion of the work. And it's always nice when Hegel provides us, some sort of schematic summary and lays out for us what the connections are supposed to be between what we're doing now and talking about now and what went on before. And that's nice for several reasons. One is it does, in fact, help us figure out what he's talking about. Hegel is not the most clear thinker at every single point. Now, a lot of that is because of what his task is and what he's attempting to get down on paper in front of us, which is living thought. But it's also, nice in part because it helps to exemplify something that Hegel has been insisting on this entire time. The previous stuff still plays a role, right? It still matters. This is what Aufhebung or sublation actually involves, right? It's not people have this imagination of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and, you got your thesis, and you start there, and then you have an opposition, your antithesis, and then you have a synthesis that takes, the best parts of both and kind of combines them, and then throws the stuff away and says, all right, now we move on from here. that's not really what Hegel's doing. Instead, things are supposed to be kept, and what's essential to them is supposed to be incorporated and given new meaning, greater meaning, within the larger context that's going on. And so we can see what Hegel's doing here as a culmination of the entire work of the self, something that came about early on in the work with the self-consciousness section. You notice, for example, in talking about the first world here, that it's a world that involves recognition, anerkennen, as something important. Well, that was important all the way back in the self-consciousness section. It remained important in the reason part of the work, much longer, much larger, and it remains absolutely essential in the spirit part of the work. So let's see what he has to say here. He tells us that this self of conscience, spirit that is directly aware of itself as absolute truth and being, as we saw in the previous paragraph, is the third self. Now, that's a nice, striking statement. The third self. Great. What is the third self, and what were the other ones? Conscience is the third in a sequence. What is the first one? Here he talks about worlds and self. So he says, we've reached it as the outcome of a third world of spirit, and we shall briefly compare it with the two preceding ones. Now we get the schematic representation, right? But we don't want to just look at these in order. We want to see, well, what is Hegel making of the path that he has traversed before? So he tells us the totality or actuality which shows itself to be the truth of the ethical world. What's the ethical world? That's what we started with in spirit, right? This world of Sittlichkeit, where we know what our duties are, we know our place. And yet, as for example, the Antigone showed us, or the entire Sophoclean Thebaid series of plays shows us, sometimes duties can conflict with other duties, and sometimes our ethical grounding isn't so absolute because it collides with another ethical grounding that appears to be just as absolute. So he goes on and he says, the ethical world winds up showing the truth of itself in the self of what? The legal person. You'll remember that was the culmination of that section. So he says here, the wonderful phrase, its existence consists in its being acknowledged by others. The German is a lot more direct. Ihr Dasein ist anerkannt sein, right? Notice the sein in both of them. The being there, the existence, is being recognized by others. What gives you your da, your place, is other people recognizing that you belong in that place. Or even, perhaps in conflict, contesting that you belong in that place. Rivalry can be a form of recognition at times. And the legal person is given some sort of standing within their society through a code of laws, right? But there's a problem here. He says, just as this person is the self that's devoid of substance, so its existence is an abstract reality. It's too abstract. This is the problem with legal personhood. A section, by the way, where he once again brings up Stoicism, right? And Stoicism, Hegel associated with a sort of purely formal conception of the self. So he says the person counts, but that is simply as a person. The self is the point immediately at rest in the element of its being. That point is not separated off from its universality, and therefore the two are not actively related to each other. I am my legal persona, and that's all there is. And that's all there can be at that point. That's why we moved on to the second world, the world of culture, right? He says, the second world self is the world of culture which has attained its truth, or it is spirit that is recovered from its dividedness. the world of culture was, in large part, this division between itself, and it actually led to a kind of insanity, an Irrtum, as we saw, which then required a move past that into the world of faith and the accompanying world of pure insight, which led us to the Enlightenment, which led us ultimately to absolute freedom and the terror. That's the part that we're talking about here, absolute freedom. He says, in this self, that first immediate unity of individuality and universality is sundered. It is split aside, right? There's a tenon, a splitting that takes place here. He goes on, and he says, the universal, which all the same remains a purely spiritual entity, the state of being acknowledged, right? So recognition is also playing a role here in absolute freedom, this state of being acknowledged, or a universal willing and knowing. The problem here is that it becomes an object and content for the self, which is good, right? The self needs to be able to depict to itself what is the universal and how it fits into the universal, or even is the universal. But, he says, it does not have the form of an existence free from the self. So in this self, it obtains no filling, no positive content. And here's a very interesting thing to say, to conclude, to talk about, he began this part by saying, not just, well, there's a self of this, a second self, and then there's a second world. The second self is a world, the world of culture, right? And he concludes by saying it doesn't have a world. That's a real problem now, isn't it? So what is our third world? The one that's not yet quite finished at this point. The world of moral self-consciousness, which we've explored quite a bit in the two previous sections and are now going to explore new shapes of in this new section on conscience. Perhaps in conscience lies the key. So he says, moral self-consciousness does let its universality go free, so it becomes a nature of its own. It holds fast to it within itself as a superseded aufgehobenes moment. But, he says, it's merely an insincere play of alternating these two determinations. We've seen this insincerity both in the section where it was labeled as such, right, previous to this one, dissemblance, but also in the earlier section on the moral self-consciousness. So he says, it is as conscience that it first has something new, something that can change the way in which things are being played out. What is that? He says, it has in its self-certainty, Selbstgewissheit, a content for the previously empty duty. The problem with duty in the past in this was that we couldn't quite pin it down. We had this general conception of it, that's great, but then it's really abstract, and then we have specific duties. None of them actually measure up to real duty. We have all these other problems of, nature and inclinations and happiness and all these other things tied in together. And it seemed like we couldn't actually do duty anyway. It was like a weird sort of paradox, wasn't it? Now we actually have a content. He says we have a content for the previously empty duty and also for the right and universal will that were empty of content. Why do we have a content for them? Because they're in me. They're in me, the individual. I know them through my conscience. So he says, because this self-assurance is at the same time an immediacy, conscience exists. Conscience has a place in the world, has a place in its world. And it's not happening through recognition by others at this point. It's happening through an assertion of the self, of its own self-certainty.